Buongiorno. Thank you for the opportunity to come and talk with you this morning. Thank you all for giving up some of your time to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's been referred to as modern money theory. It's not a name that we came up with. It's not necessarily a name that we would have chosen. It's what others began to call the work that we're doing, because we're so focused on helping economists and others, policymakers, to understand how a modern money system works. Economists failed us badly. They missed the economic and financial crisis almost completely. Very few people saw it coming. Few warned of what was about to happen, and those that did were largely ignored. The reason that so many economists missed the crisis, and the reason that so many continue to support bad economic policies, is that they don't understand how the modern monetary system works. Their models are flawed. Their theoretical understanding of the economy is flawed. And what my colleagues and I have worked so hard to do is to develop a new way to do economics that incorporates money and debt and finance and the way that things actually work, and to stop treating economics as a religion, as a theology, and to start understanding economics as a complex system where money and finance and debt play important roles, and where governments can play an important stabilizing role if they have the correct monetary system in place. And so what I want to describe for you this morning is what kind of powers are available to governments to help stabilize their economies when they are in crisis. And those powers are very much dependent upon the type of monetary system that is in place in the economy. Now, your monetary system, obviously, is very different from the one that we have in the United States. And so I want to talk a little bit this morning about what those important differences are and what the implications for policy are. What's being referred to as modern money theory is becoming increasingly popular around the world. In the United States, some of the biggest newspapers and most important TV shows have begun to take an interest in MMT. Is the sound okay? Okay. What we're trying to do, again, is to expose the problems in economics and to take away the myths and help people understand how the monetary system actually works. We want to focus on the operations, how things work, not in abstract, not in economic modeling world, but in the real world. And some of what I'm going to say is going to sound counterintuitive, maybe even wrong, because it's so different from what we all hear from policymakers and from most economists. But I'm asking you to keep an open mind and follow the argument to where it leads. A proper understanding of the monetary system is the first step toward developing a stronger economy. We're all thinking a lot about money. When there is a financial crisis or a debt crisis, everyone naturally begins to think about money. You need money to service debts. Well, what is money? We think of money as something we can pick up and hold, something that exists in physical form, something that is limited, something that there is only so much of in the world. But in the modern era, when we have modern money, most money is created by keystrokes. It doesn't exist in physical form. It's abstract. When we think about the money of account, it's an accounting device. Money is a way to keep track of the claims that we hold on others and the claims that they hold on us. It's a form of debt, an IOU. Think about the different units of account in countries around the world. The Australian dollar is a unit of account. The US dollar, the Japanese yen, the British pound, the euro. You should notice something different. All of those other units of account have a nation state associated with them. The euro does not. The money of account is something abstract, like a meter or a hectare or a kilometer. It is something that you cannot see or feel. It is representational. It's something humans design. In any modern nation state, the money of account is chosen by the national government. Italy chose the euro to become its national unit of account. Any government in the world defines its unit of account, imposes taxes and fees and other obligations in that unit, decides what it will accept in payment to itself, and importantly, decides how it will make its own payments. Most governments in the world choose their own unique unit of account and issue their own unique currency. Almost all governments in the world do that. One nation, one money. The US dollar, the Japanese yen, the British pound, the Mexican peso. Most governments also require that taxes be paid in a currency that the state has the exclusive right to issue. These currencies are sovereign currencies. When you have a sovereign currency, the government can never go broke. It can never run out of money. It can afford to buy anything that is for sale in that unit of account. It does not need to borrow in its own currency in order to spend. It can set the policy interest rate at any level it chooses. This should be clear as you look around the world and you see interest rates in Japan and in the UK and in the US, where all of these sovereign currency issuers are in control of the interest rates in their economies. Countries with a sovereign currency have more policy space than countries without a sovereign currency. They can do things that countries without their own currencies cannot do. And those things are important because it means that in times of crisis, they can stabilize their economies. They can achieve full employment. The euro is an exceptional case where the currency is divorced from the nation. The euro is effectively a foreign currency to you and to the other members of the Eurozone. All 17 countries that use the euro are users of the currency, not issuers of the currency, the way the US, Japan, Canada, the UK, Australia, and other countries are. As a result, the countries that use the euro lack the powers of a sovereign issuer. Money matters. A sovereign government should be able to issue the currency it spends. Otherwise, it lacks the power to keep its domestic economy on track. MMT emphasizes, as a goal for policy, full employment. Unemployment imposes huge costs on society, both direct and indirect. Indirect costs include things like social exclusion and the loss of freedom. Your skills degrade because you aren't using your skills in the workforce. It can do psychological harm, increase suicide rates, increase divorce rates, leads to the loss of motivation, undermines family relationships. Some of these costs are very hard to measure. In the US, economists actually do attempt to get at these numbers. What is the cost of unemployment when you consider both the loss of output, what's not being produced because someone isn't employed, and also all of those indirect costs? And the estimate in the United States for a young person who is out of work and out of school, it costs the U.S. more than $37,000 a year in combined costs. So these are tremendous costs for society. Over the course of a lifetime, unemployment adds up. The longer you remain unemployed, the more those costs build, and suddenly you're looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars in costs. Even though the U.S. is doing relatively well, we've avoided going back into recession. We stopped the huge job losses that we were incurring. At the end of 2008, the U.S. was losing 800,000 jobs a month. We've turned that around, and we're now increasing jobs. We're growing the economy. We're creating new jobs. But we aren't at full employment. That green line in the graph shows where the U.S. economy could be if we were at full employment. The blue line below is where we actually are. The difference between the two is all of the lost output and lost income that results from our failure to run our own economy at full employment. And those losses add up. One economist in Australia has estimated that the U.S. is losing the equivalent of $9.5 billion every single day because we don't get back up on the green line. We don't get to full employment. And all of that amounts to losses to the economy in the billions and billions of dollars every single day. You say, what does it take to create jobs? We ask this in the U.S. all the time. And some political parties say, well, it's too much regulation and taxes are too high. And if we had less regulation and lower taxes, that would lead to massive job creation. But if you ask the employers themselves, in poll after poll after poll, they will tell you that the number one thing holding them back is sales. They aren't hiring because there isn't strong demand in the economy. There aren't enough sales to lead them to want to hire more workers and invest in more capital. Sales create jobs, and income creates sales. And spending creates income. One person's spending becomes another person's income. And so if you think about government and government policy, when government is able to spend more, produces more income for someone. And if income leads to sales, and sales lead to jobs, then spending can help create jobs. Austerity is the opposite of that. Austerity depresses people's incomes. Takes their income away so they have less to spend. Less spending, fewer sales, fewer jobs. Every government has to decide how to deal with unemployment, because every economy in the world experiences unemployment. So what do you do with the unemployed? Do you just simply leave them unemployed, let them stay home, pay them nothing? Or do you have a program in place to provide income for the unemployed? And if you do have a program to provide income for the unemployed, do you have them work for the income so that they become employed? Or do you simply send them a check to stay home and remain unemployed? MMT favors what we refer to as a transition job. A job opportunity for anyone who is prepared to work but unable to find employment out there in the economy, either in the private or the public sector. So a transition job would give unemployed people something useful to do and to pay them to perform that useful task. It works as a stabilizer. When the economy turns down, you take those workers who become unemployed and you put them to work. You give them something useful to do and you pay them a wage to do that. As the income helps support sales, keeps the economy from continuing to go down, eventually you get the economic recovery that allows the private sector to start pulling those workers back into private employment. So it works like a buffer stock. The employment pool grows when the economy turns down and shrinks as the economy improves. And it helps to stabilize spending in the economy and therefore stabilize jobs. It reduces the losses that are borne by the private sector when unemployment is high. All of those costs that we just talked about. It prevents workers' skills from degrading, gives them something useful to do, to keep their skills up. It can even improve skills, gives them a sense of purpose. We had a program like this in the U.S. during the Great Depression. President Roosevelt instituted a massive jobs program for both young people and not young people. They worked in projects building roads, hospitals, schools, bridges. The programs hired architects, engineers, painters, poets, and actors. The program required the government to run big deficits. Obviously, this is a problem for some people. In the U.S., basically we have two groups. our policymakers fall into one of two groups when it comes to thinking about the deficit. One of those groups is very opposed to deficit spending, thinks governments should live within their means, only spend what they collect in taxes, balance their budgets. They would support rules to require governments to balance their budgets. They don't believe there's any such thing as a good deficit. They support immediate austerity to reduce deficits. The other group supports limited deficit spending. A small deficit might be required if the economy turns down, but it needs to be reversed and balanced over the course of the business cycle. So this group wants to wait to impose austerity until the economy is a bit stronger. We refer to the first group as fiscal hawks. The hawk is a fierce bird that won't tolerate any deficits at all. And the second group as deficit doves. The dove is a kinder, softer, gentler bird, more tolerant. But at the end of the day, both groups view the deficit as something to avoid. Now, why do they worry? Both the deficit hawks and the deficit doves are worried about the negative consequences of running deficits. What if markets get angry and interest rates get high? What if the debt becomes unsustainable, unserviceable? What if deficits cause inflation? MMT looks at these questions very differently. And the answers to those questions depend on some factors that aren't usually considered by either of those groups. If the government takes advantage of its status as the issuer of the currency, it can keep the deficit at the right level. It can avoid discipline from the bond markets. It will not ever face a solvency problem, and it can control inflation. MMT is supportive of deficit spending when there is unemployment in the economy. As long as the real resources, humans, unemployed labor, capital, factories, as long as the real resources are there, they can be employed safely up to the point of full employment. And so we like to think of ourselves not as a fierce deficit hawk or an apologetic deficit dove, but as a wiser deficit owl. We would never support arbitrary limits on the size of the deficit or on the duration, how long it's okay to run the deficit. You cannot know that answer ahead of time. We support allowing the deficit to expand to achieve full employment. And we accept that it is the government's responsibility as the issuer of the currency to offset any fall in aggregate spending, to make sure that total spending in the economy is at the level necessary to achieve full employment. How does a sovereign currency issuer spend? How does the U.S. government spend? It spends by directing its bank, the Federal Reserve Bank, to credit someone's bank account. This is frequently done without the government ever even writing a check. In the modern money era, government spending is accomplished through keystrokes, computer entries. Chairman Ben Bernanke has made this very clear when he was asked how the U.S. government was paying for all of its spending operations. Chairman Bernanke said, all of the other banks and recipients of these funds keep accounts. When the government spends, we use the keyboard, his words, to mark up the size of someone's account. This is modern money. It results in the creation of new government money, and as Alan Greenspan, the former Fed chairman, has said, a country that is in debt in its own currency can never run out of money or be forced to miss a payment. What happens when we pay our taxes? We tend to think of taxes as the thing that finances the government's operation. But is that really true? In the U.S., it's not what's really happening. When we pay our taxes, the numbers in our bank account go down. But the U.S. government doesn't actually get anything. There's no gold coin that drops into a bucket. Our spreadsheet entry goes down. Our ledger is reduced. Taxes allow the government to take spending power away from us. Taxes are money down the drain. But the government doesn't get anything real from us when it collects taxes. Okay. When we think of the deficit, government spends more than it takes from us. Government spends 100, taxes 90. That 10 went somewhere. And where it goes is to the non-government sector. The government is only one sector in the economy. You cannot analyze a multi-sector economy as if only one sector is important. You have to understand how the government's budget balance interacts with the other sectors in the economy. So there are three sectors that you must pay attention to: the government sector, the private sector, and the foreign sector. Those three sectors interact in important ways. There is an important rule that we must remember. Every sector cannot be in surplus at the same time. It is mathematically impossible because one sector's surplus has to come from some other sector's deficit. The only way a sector can be in surplus is if its income is greater than its spending. And that occurs when another sector's spending is greater than its income. This is how balance sheets work. So some sector in the economy will always be in deficit, and some sector will always be in surplus. But everyone can't be in deficit, and everyone can't be in surplus. So the question is, who needs to be in deficit? If someone has to be the deficit sector, who should that be? Okay, before I answer the question, let me remind you. The government's deficit is equal, always, to the penny, to the non-government's surplus. The government's deficit is the non-government's surplus. If you cut the government deficit, you cut the non-government surplus to the penny. If your government is in surplus, then the non-government runs the deficit. Okay? This is the graph of the government's budget and the private sector's balance for Italy. This is the government's balance. This is the government deficit. You see here, if the deficit is 5% of GDP, the private sector's surplus reflects that. When the deficit is large, 8% of GDP, the private sector's surplus is large. And back in these days, the mid-1990s, Italy had trade surpluses as well. So the private sector had a huge surplus, partly because the rest of the world was buying more from you than you were buying from them, and partly because the government was spending more than it was taking from you. So you had two sectors feeding your surplus back then. Now you have only one, because your current account is in deficit, and so your entire surplus is coming from the government's deficit. This is the graph for Ireland. Notice the relationship. The bigger the government deficit, the bigger the private sector surplus. And notice that they move in opposite directions. Cut the deficit, cut the private sector surplus. Greece, same sort of pattern. Spain, same sort of pattern. Germany, same sort of pattern. The UK, the bigger the deficit run by the public sector, the bigger the surplus run by the private sector. Japan, same thing. The US, same thing. This is a graph that shows all three sectors, the foreign sector, the public sector, and the private sector for the United States. What I want you to notice is the blue area. The blue area is the private sector's balance. Almost always, you see the private sector is in surplus, above the zero line. Whenever it's above the zero line, private sector has a surplus. The government is in the red, figuratively and literally. The government is in deficit. They are below the zero line. This green area is the balance in the rest of the world. Long time ago, 30 years ago, the U.S. was a net exporter. We sold more to the rest of the world than we bought from them. And so we accumulated a surplus. And the government also ran deficits, and that helped us accumulate surpluses. So that's where all these private sector surpluses came from. But then when President Clinton was in office, for the first time in generations, the U.S. government balanced its budget and started running surpluses. And this was widely viewed as a very good thing. The government was being fiscally responsible. But what happened to the private sector's balance, and what happened to the U.S. economy as a result? This little red area here shows the federal government, U.S. government's budget, going positive, becoming a surplus. And so the government started taking more from us than it spent. So we lost. Our balance went down. At the same time, the rest of the world was taking more from us than they spent buying goods and services from us. That pushed our balance down even further. And so you can see what happened to the private sector in the U.S. during those years. We went from always running surpluses, the private sector, to carrying very, very large deficits. As a percent of GDP, our deficits were around 7%. That meant that we, households and businesses, the private sector in the U.S., were spending more than our income year after year after year after year. How? By going into debt. We took on lots of debt to finance that spending, and ultimately it was unsustainable. Why? Because the private sector, households and firms, are just users of the currency. We have to earn the currency in order to make our payments, and when we have too much debt, we get into trouble making our payments, and then we stop borrowing and try to pay down debt. And that's what we did, and it caused a recession in the U.S., and the government's budget went right back into deficit where it belongs. And the big deficits the U.S. government has been running lately have helped put the private sector back into surplus so we can pay our debt, repair our balance sheets, spend income that leads to sales that lead to jobs. So MMT emphasizes the relationship between sovereign money and sovereignty over your policy. States that issue their own currency, a floating exchange rate, can never be forced to default on debt that is denominated in their own currency. A sovereign currency issuer doesn't have to pay market interest rates. A sovereign currency issuer can use its powers to tax and spend to keep the economy at full employment. A sovereign currency issuer controls inflation with these same taxing and spending powers. A sovereign currency issuer has full use of its fiscal policy space. Countries in the Eurozone have much less space. And this is going to be the topic of my talk tomorrow. Thank you.